Well, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our next session, we are delighted to welcome the Vice President of Government Affairs for Chevron, a presenting platinum sponsor, Karen Knutson. Karen.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you all very much. I am very pleased on behalf of Chevron for the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, the USTR Ambassador Katherine Tai. Ambassador Tai's career in international economic diplomacy and public service has been beyond distinguished and reads like a roadmap to her current role. Yale undergrad, Harvard Law, clerkships in private practice, then off to the Hill, where she rose to the role of Chief Trade Counsel and Staff Director for the Trade Subcommittee on House Ways and Means. Then over to the office that she currently leads in various roles, including Chief Counsel for China Trade Enforcement, where she represented U.S. interests before the WTO. With a background like that, it is no wonder that she was unanimously confirmed by the Senate to serve on the President's cabinet in 2021. Unanimously confirmed. No small feat in today's Congress. The President and we are fortunate to have her advocating for our country. Ambassador Tai has brought a vision to the Trade Rep's office. She works to ensure that trade and trade agreements benefit all of our citizens, that global trade flows contribute to our efforts to balance growth and protect the environment, and that the agreements that countries have signed are enforced so that the private sector and citizens have a greater confidence in the rule of law. This is a vision we can all support: open markets, fair trade, the rule of law, and inclusive growth. So, Madam Ambassador, we are all so pleased that you're able to join us here today, and we look forward to your insights on how America can empower and deepen our trade relationships and take advantage of the forces shaping the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Karen, thank you. And thank you again for Chevron's very, very generous support for this conference, and indeed for the Council of the Americas throughout the entire year. I'm so very pleased to have the opportunity to run this conversation with the U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Tai, who's been very well introduced. I do want to reemphasize something, though. Unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate, that's got to be a record in today's Washington, so you're doing something right.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. It's delightful to be here with all of you. And I think that I had a conversation with you in a similar time of year 2 years ago. We did that purely virtually. And look at where we are today. This is really wonderful.
Well, your memory is terrific. 2021 was the last time the ambassador joined us, and we had a great conversation then about your ambitions looking forward. And now we have a record of a couple of years to see how things have transpired and where we may be going. You have global responsibilities, obviously. There's some big questions out there broadly, but this is a Western Hemisphere conference. Question is, for you, where does the Western Hemisphere fit into your overall global vision?
That's a fabulous question, and what a great place to be asking that question in this building, of all places. When we look at the rest of the world, I think that we have to be very conscious about where we are. And it's quite interesting as we push into the new frontiers of cyberspace and outer space, that so much of our reality, so much what defines our opportunity is still about geography and about where we sit in the world. And so I think that that is a foundational touchstone for thinking about the U.S. approach to international economic engagement with the Western Hemisphere. This is our home. And the countries in the Western Hemisphere, these are our neighbors. So I think that today in 2023, coming off of several years rocked by, discombobulated deeply by the pandemic and all of the supply chain disruptions that have opened our eyes to the fragility of the industrial linkages of the globalized world that we're in right now, we're bringing really a renewed focus to our place in our own region. And I do think that as we think about ways of building resilience into the global economy, that ensuring that there are more complete supply chains within regions is one way to build in that cushion or shock absorption when we inevitably come upon the next big crisis or shock, whether it's climate related, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's because of a flare up in geopolitical tensions. So that is informing how we are thinking about our friends and our neighbors in our own region. How can we recombine ourselves? How can we take our traditional tools and apply them in new ways to look for more resilience, more sustainability, and also more inclusiveness in our economic outcomes? And so it's a very exciting time to be doing trade because there are a lot of new conversations that we are having and a new sense of urgency and purpose as well.
USMCA is a huge part of that. You personally are to be congratulated for your personal role in bringing that to fruition, as many others as well, but you played a very, very important role on a bipartisan basis. There's been a lot of conversation already this morning on USMCA. Let me ask you a two-parted question if I can. The first is, we have to make sure that existing trade agreements work well, implementation, and I know you're focused on that. We'd love to hear about some of your work there. And the second part is a question you might anticipate from a Latin America-focused audience. Would you see USMCA at some point being an option for other countries in the region, or a model at least that could be contemplated elsewhere in the hemisphere?
Great. Recall that when we were renegotiating the NAFTA, it was in, that effort started in 2017. So we were seeing some of the larger backlash against globalization really taking shape. So also remember that there were at least two purposes to the renegotiation of the NAFTA. The first one was to modernize. It was almost 25 years old. Our economies are different today than they were in the mid-1990s. But the other part, really important, was to remediate some parts of the NAFTA that had really come under criticism over time. And one of those was that the NAFTA, like a lot of our legacy trade policies, is built on a set of incentives that is meant to maximize cost efficiency. And in that kind of a world, the concern was that I think we saw borne out over time, a downward pressure and a degradation with respect to protections for our people and in terms of our workers, and also in terms of downward pressure on environmental standards. So really important parts of the USMCA were about finding ways to turn those narratives on their head. How could you have, nevertheless, this trade agreement binding together three economies that could be empowering workers, that could be trying to raise standards across the board, and also that could be tying our integrated industries more tightly together, how to address leakage. You see a lot of that in, for example, the autos rules of origin and innovation to try to recognize the integration between the three and then to reinforce that. Ensuring that this has meaning is really, really important, and that's why our enforcement and implementation are at the top of our priorities in terms of our trade agenda. So that's with respect to ensuring that we use that labor-specific, facility-specific mechanism to help bring force to Mexico's own labor reforms. The case that we've brought against Canada now in its second iteration, once again, to realize that market access to Canada's dairy market that has been a source of friction for a very, very long time, and then also to use all of the tools in the USMCA to address the tensions that we see flaring up with respect to biotechnology trade and also the energy policies in Mexico to ensure that the spirit of our partnership in North America is able to express itself within the policies that are important to each of us. So enforcement implementation at the very top of our list across the board. To your second question, in terms of would we expand the USMCA, let me put it to the crowd this way. Let's look at all of the innovations in the USMCA and understand that those were innovations that we had brought about in 2019 and 2020. And then since then, we have had the experience of the pandemic, and also now Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which have put more pressure on the basic components that go into everything in our world. Energy, which goes into all of this physical world, and also food and food insecurity, which is what the energy that goes into human beings and all of the things that we rely on for sustenance. So I think the way I'd look at it, and the task I would pose to everyone is, what are the innovations in USMCA that we can carry forward in looking at our other partnerships in the region, and to look at the regional potential, and focus less on the format of the FTA itself. We have more FTAs in this region than any other region in the world. And I think that the traditional trade agreement was something that we built out for our aspirations that predate the challenges that we're facing today. So if the focus right now is on ensuring that we have more resilience in our economies, more sustainability, and more inclusiveness, let's look at the tools, including and especially the ones that are innovative in USMCA, and let's figure out how we apply them to the partnerships that we should be focusing on in the region.
The world has certainly changed. Last time you addressed us, as you yourself just noted, was in the midst of a pandemic, and it was virtual, and this is the first time we're back together since 2019, so totally agree with that. I mean, of course, Russia's unbelievable invasion of Ukraine, et cetera. The world has changed. Let me bring in another topic that has been, of course, under discussion already in the course of this morning, which is cleaner energy. We just had a conversation with Deputy Secretary Turk, where he was talking about energy transition and the vast opportunities of the Western Hemisphere. And I just wonder, from the perspective of the trade agenda and the U.S. Trade Representative, how can trade policy meaningfully advance the clean energy transition that I think all of us are seeking, and that Latin America and the Caribbean can play a meaningful role in?
So I think that this example is one of the most powerful in illustrating the challenges that we're facing today. Talk about sustainability and resilience. What an opportunity there is in the midst of a challenge, right? And as you've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, we see that in order to move ourselves from where we are today to where we need to go, we need to have a vision for the transition, and we need to be ready to deploy the tools that we have as governments, to create incentives for the tools that the private sector has, that civil society has, to really align ourselves onto one team to realize this transition. Now, what I would say is, in a way, what we are doing and what we need is a really quite a powerful industrial policy. We know what our aspiration is, to have robust, resilient, new energy sources that are sustainable. It's going to have to be a collective move in this direction. So you see us embracing a kind of a new version, a more American version of industrial policy. The role for trade policy is that these two things have to work together. I've said this, and last week you heard Jake Sullivan say this. Our embrace of industrial policy is one that is based on markets, finding tools to create the incentives in our markets, and it is designed to work with our trade policy. And I think that this is a really key part of linking up our vision for our region. How do we find those industries that are critical to all of us and bring all of our tools to bear to do it in a collaborative way? And I think that if we can figure that out, then we really have the keys in our hands to a future that is bright, and one that raises standards, and one that is built to extend that runway ahead of us for our children and our children's children. So it's an incredible opportunity that we have, and the sooner that we all can plug into this vision, the sooner we can get to work to refine our approach, because this is different from the liberalization for liberalization's sake version of global trade that we have had for the last several decades. We're not meaning to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But understand that the baby is to raise living standards, to make the most reasonable and sustainable use of our natural resources, and to create a prosperity that can be more inclusive and long-lasting.
I'm so pleased that you put Latin America, that you centered Latin America in that conversation, because the opportunities really are massive. And to have it being said from a cabinet level official in the Biden administration really does help those of us in the private sector who are trying to promote exactly that vision, to have the ammunition to be able to say, look, I mean, this isn't just us saying it, this is the administration recognizes that, and we can't get to our goals nationally without Latin America and the Caribbean helping us, because that's where the resources are. So I think your comments are very, very well made. Appreciate that. Ambassador, you were just in Brazil.
Yes.
Brazil, the largest economy by far in the Western Hemisphere, new government. What'd you find there?
So this was my first trip to Brazil as U.S. Trade Representative, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this. It was also my first trip to Brazil as a person.
Hopefully not your last.
It's certainly not my last. And I only got to see Brasilia. So as I understand it, Brasilia is a very unique place, and the rest of Brazil is very, very different, and it's really large. You know, what really struck me was a lot of synergies between the United States and Brazil. And also, I think it's really helped me with putting it together with my experiences traveling to our other Western Hemisphere partners, really thinking about ourselves as the product of an earlier version of globalization, the colonial imperial project. So a couple thoughts here. The Brazilian economy, very, very large. I think 220 million people versus 350 for us. Also, because of our historical ties, an agricultural production powerhouse. For President Lula, facing a lot of the same challenges that President Biden is facing, one with respect to sustainability of the natural resources, and Brazil is blessed with this Amazon rainforest. How to sustainably manage that particular resource and to maintain and create that engine for further industrial development and growth. Also, something else in my meetings with civil society, to hear workers, especially women workers, feel the pride in bringing President Lula back, that vision for a more inclusive economy. Certainly something that I see here working on trade in President Biden's cabinet. So I think that there are tremendous opportunities. Now, that's not to say that there aren't incredible challenges as well. And we see those developing, and the world today was very complex. Very complex. But I think in terms of the conversations that I had with my government counterparts in Brasilia, this idea that there are industrial ambitions that we can work on collaboratively to build these supply chains through the Western Hemisphere is one that I felt like I got a lot of responsiveness to, and something that we're going to be very, very interested in building out.
One of the things we've been talking a lot about again this morning is the idea of, in terms of building those supply chains, the role of uncertainty in terms of the private sector, the role of rule of law, the importance of agreements once struck to be implemented and said. And again, thank you for your work in terms of enforcement and implementation. And one of the things that we find is that when you have those opportunities to regularize the environment with countries in the Western Hemisphere, but I suppose it's true worldwide, it creates the certainty that the private sector is looking for to make those investments that create the jobs that we're all seeking, et cetera, both in our country as well as abroad. And frankly, it backs out the opportunities perhaps for some of our other major competitors in the world too, which is a real issue in the Western Hemisphere.
I think that's absolutely correct. And I think in terms of that, those concepts around rule of law, predictability, stability, efforts to address corruption, it also backs out to a commonality of democratic systems. Democracies are hard, but I think that we understand each other and the challenges that we have. in our world to make our economies work for our people, to be able to make the case and demonstrate to our people and our electorate, right, that we are working on their behalf. And I think that is another strength in terms of our relationship with our friends and neighbors in our own region.
One of the things that we hear from our members, but also others, is that in terms of attacking some of that corruption, which does come up all the time, and you're right to mention it, thank you for doing that, is the role of digitization in terms of transparency, efficiency, lowering costs. And Latin America, sorry to say, is not in the lead globally in terms of digital uptake. Seems to be a huge opportunity there, and this will be our last question because our time is running out, but I did want to make sure we at least touch on digital because it's such a major focus of you and of USTR, no?
Certainly. I think that there's tremendous potential and opportunity in digital, in terms of creating efficiencies in systems, in terms of regularizing and broadening access. That said, I think that each of us is grappling with the rapid transformation of our economies and our societies in this digital era. And part of the challenge is going to be how do we harness the opportunities of digital while maintaining open, pro-competition economies that continue to create the room for new entrants and startups to grow. So I think that the challenges are many here, but it is really important for us in the international economic conversation to be engaging and to be knitting up our regulators and our policymakers and legislators at home so that we can all be having that conversation around where each of us judges the appropriate regulatory framework is going to be for the digital components of our economy, and how to ensure that as we move out in that legislative regulatory space, that our economies maintain their interoperability and compatibility.
Boy, I wish we had twice as long as we have. We don't. That time flew by, as it always does, and we knew it would. Before we thank the ambassador for her presence here today, we would ask that for the last session you remain in your seats so that we can begin it right away, and then after that we will conclude the program for today. But with that, Ambassador, you have such a heart for Latin America, it's obvious, and we appreciate that. We want to help support that from the private sector perspective. If there's anything we can do from the council perspective, collectively or on behalf of the individual companies, I'm sure you've talked to most of them at some point and will again, but what a terrific pleasure to have you with us again. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking the ambassador for her presence here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Just come right out here.